Greetings from San Diego, California. This interactive multinational teleconference is reaching you live in English and Spanish through a unique and complex international telecommunications network via satellite, microwave, and cable. This program brings together distinguished institutions representing education, business, and government in more than a dozen countries in the Americas and Europe. We look forward to hearing from you. This is the 6th International Training Center video conference of the year 2004 series entitled Success with World-Class Competencies and the 135th ITC program delivered over the span of 15 years. I'm Dr. Farhad Saba, Professor of Educational Technology at San Diego State University and the moderator of today's program. With growing competition, the rapid pace of technological change, and ever more complex local, regional, and global markets we see today, it is increasingly obvious that individuals, organizations, and communities that focus on specific strengths and niche areas of service or markets will become tomorrow's world-class leaders. But acquiring knowledge and understanding of population dynamics and consumer preferences or satisfaction is not enough to guarantee productive success in today's environment. We must now be capable of planning all our endeavors through the use of sound statistical information and the application of appropriate measuring and quantifying techniques. This is particularly crucial in key areas such as management, marketing, research and development, and client services. This exciting video conference will present a broad overview of the main statistical strategies and techniques available for us today by the non-statistics specialist and some of the common fallacies and mistakes of statistical interpretation that often lead to faulty policies, strategies, and actions. In the increasingly complex globalized society we live in today, it is more important than ever that we support our intuition and qualitative action plans with quantitative measures and appropriate evaluation instruments to ensure continuous improvement and the consistent pursuit of our goals and aspirations. Ms. Susan Mitchell, our distinguished invited speaker, will suggest the adoption of simple rules and formulas that will start us on the road towards increased achievement and success. In Module 1, Ms. Mitchell will define niche marketing and the importance of demographic and survey data that are at your disposal. Then she will describe in understandable language primary concepts in statistics that you must know in order to make use of such data and interpret it to your benefit. She will conclude Module 1 with a discussion of how surveys are constructed and conducted, and what you need to know in order to analyze survey results and determine their integrity and validity. In Module 2, our distinguished speaker will provide you with more detailed information as to what surveys and tests measure, what these measurements mean, how they can be misinterpreted, and how they should be interpreted. The information in Module 2 is vital for you in navigating today's data-rich environment and in being able to use data-based information intelligently in all sectors of our society. Module 2 will help you to turn data into knowledge that will help you in becoming more competitive and in gaining the edge to succeed. Ms. Susan Mitchell is a writer, author, and lecturer specializing in demographics and social and consumer trends. Her articles have appeared in numerous publications, and she is frequently cited as a trend expert in the national media, including Time magazine, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Times. She has appeared on the Today Show, MSNBC, Fox Network News, and Oprah to discuss the baby boom and generational issues. Ms. Mitchell is the author of several demographic reference books, including American Attitudes and Generation X, the Young Adult Market. Her most recent book, American Generations, examines the demographics of the 5 living generations of Americans: millennials, Generation X, baby boomers, the swing generation, and the World War II generation. Ms. Mitchell frequently speaks to and consults with business and organizations about generational issues. A former contributing editor of American Demographics and former editor of the Boomer Report, a newsletter tracking the baby boom generation, Ms. Mitchell has done extensive research on the demographics and lifestyles of the different generations. She has a B.S. in psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you and welcome to today's program. Let me begin with a question. There is no doubt that we live in a data-rich environment. We are constantly bombarded with survey results, poll results, and statistical information of various kinds. Despite our data-rich environment, are we as professionals who lead busy lives better informed? Also, the concepts you will be discussing today are applicable worldwide.
Well, let me say first that, in fact, these concepts are applicable worldwide. The basic methodology of the analysis and the quantitative methods are cross-cultural. They are mathematically based and are not dependent on anyone's society. That said, some of the characteristics you might look at or ways you would apply them might vary in different parts of the world. In terms of the data-rich environment, we are, in fact, in an environment where there is too much data. And that's one reason you really need to have the skills to properly evaluate the data. You need to be able to get the good data and avoid the bad data. And the only way you can do that is if you understand the basic methodology behind the production of all this data.
Thank you, and let's begin with Module 1.
We operate today in an environment that encompasses both rapid technological change and increasing globalization. Our understanding of this environment is key to success in education, business, government, and civil society. A basic understanding of population demographics is one important prerequisite to successfully navigating the world today. But success is also dependent on having a deeper and more specific understanding of different segments of the population. This is particularly true for businesses that find themselves facing competition from both small local companies and large global enterprises. One strategy that is going to be increasingly important is identifying and serving niche markets. Niche marketing may refer to selling a niche product or service, that is, one that fits a very specific need or interest. Or it may refer to a marketing strategy in which a product with fairly broad appeal is marketed to a sub-segment of the population. For example, a company that sells products for maintaining swimming pools is, in effect, marketing a niche product, since most households do not have swimming pools. Large companies, such as those selling soft drinks, often engage in niche marketing campaigns in which they tailor their message to a certain segment of the population, such as teenagers. These advertisements are not meant to appeal to the broader population, even though the product is purchased by most people. Whether you're selling a niche product or service, or you are crafting an advertising campaign directed at a niche within the larger market, successful niche marketing requires a thorough understanding of the population being targeted. Gaining this understanding requires the use of sound statistical information and the application of appropriate measuring and quantifying techniques. Put another way, we need to be able to acquire and organize large amounts of detailed information about the characteristics, opinions, and behavior of consumers. Remarkably, we are gathering more information than ever before, but we frequently fail to properly organize and evaluate this information. Even trained survey researchers and statisticians sometimes make mistakes. The purpose of today's video conference is to help you understand some of the main statistical strategies and techniques that can be used by non-specialists to create business strategies based on sound data while avoiding making common mistakes. One reason that some businesses fail to fully take advantage of the data available to them is that many people find statistics intimidating because of the underlying mathematics. Some people may also fear misinterpreting statistics, particularly when the methodology is somewhat counterintuitive. The jargon of statistics also tends to make it seem inaccessible to people who do not have specialized training in the field. However, many of the basic statistical concepts are relatively easy to learn, and best of all, you really do not need to know complex statistical calculations in order to use statistical information. All you need is an understanding of some of the basic concepts. Although statistics are used in a variety of disciplines, we will be primarily concerned in this video conference with the use of statistics to organize and evaluate data from surveys of the population. Therefore, we will begin by looking at some of the basics of survey methodology. If a survey, or as it is sometimes called a poll, is improperly conducted, all of the statistical methods in the world cannot produce useful information from the data. There's an expression that nicely encapsulates this problem: garbage in, garbage out. If your survey instrument or data collection methods are flawed, your results will be flawed. The science of surveys is based on probability sampling. The premise of probability sampling is that a relatively small number of individuals can accurately represent a much larger group. Although we are discussing surveys of people, sampling is also useful in other arenas, as when a manufacturer examines a sample of the product they are producing to make sure that there are few or no defects. For some people, sampling is one of the more difficult concepts to grasp because it is somewhat counterintuitive. One of the premier polling groups in the world today, the Gallup organization, conducted a survey about surveys and found that most Americans did not believe that the opinions of 2,000 people, a larger group than is typically used for national surveys in the U.S., could accurately represent the views of the entire population. This is in spite of the fact that these same respondents, as the people who answer surveys are called, generally believed that surveys do produce accurate results. Probability sampling is able to produce a generally accurate portrait of the opinions or behavior of the larger universe or target population, that is, the population being examined, because the individuals surveyed are selected randomly. A random sample ensures that everyone within the target population has an equal chance of being selected for the survey. In turn, this produces a sample that is representative of the population. The size of the group selected can be relatively small, since it is the randomness of the selection that is key. Sample size does matter, however, for various reasons. The minimum sample size varies depending on the size of the target population and the amount of specific information about the respondents that you wish to analyze. Although probability sampling generally produces accurate results, sampling accuracy, which means the ability of the sample to accurately represent the target population, increases with the size of the sample up to a point. In the U.S., with a population of over 300 million people, most of the major polling organizations survey about 1,000 to 1,500 people. Statisticians have found that samples as small as 500 can produce relatively reliable results, however, and as the sample sizes get larger than 1,000, the gains in accuracy are relatively small compared to the increasing cost. What is gained with a larger sample, however, is the ability to look more closely at a variety of demographic and other characteristics of the population. This can be particularly important in niche marketing, where the target market is a subset of those surveyed. Suppose, for example, that you want to target people who use computers at home. In much of Latin America, this is a fairly small subgroup of the total population. In a sample of 1,000 people, you might find that only 100 have computers at home. While this is sufficient to compare the responses of home computer users to the total population, it is not large enough to get much specific data about them. For example, if you want to know how the opinions and behavior of male and female home computer users differ from each other, you would need a sample larger than 100. In other words, in examining niche markets, you must often obtain a very large sample in order to capture a sufficient number of people who meet the criteria for your target market. Although a random sample of sufficient size can produce fairly accurate results, there is one final step that statisticians take to make sure that the data reflects the larger population as accurately as possible. This is the process known as weighting. The demographic characteristics of the survey respondents, such as gender, age, and geographic region, are compared to the demographics of the larger population. Differences between the sample and the larger population can result in sampling bias. In simple terms, this means that if 60% of the survey respondents are women, but women make up 50% of the population, the results of the survey will be skewed toward women. That is, women's responses will be more prevalent in the data than they are in reality. Let's look at an example of how sampling bias can skew results. Suppose you are a company that sells products to people who exercise frequently, and you want to know what percentage of the total adult population of Mexico this group constitutes. Ideally, your survey sample would precisely reflect the demographic characteristics of the Mexican population. But suppose in this case, your sample included a relatively high number of young adults. The graph shown here gives an example of the age distribution of the total population compared to our hypothetical sample. In this example, people aged 15 to 34 make up 67% of the sample, but they actually make up a lower 55% of all Mexicans aged 15 or older. Mexicans aged 55 or older make up 15% of the population in reality, but in our example, only 2% of the survey sample is in this age group. The bias toward young adults might not matter if the opinion or behavior that you're examining is distributed evenly across different age groups. But young adults are more likely than older people to exercise frequently. If well over half of the youngest age group exercises frequently, for example, and only about 10% of older adults do so, the over-representation of young adults in the sample will cause the estimate of the total percentage of Mexicans who exercise frequently to be higher than would be found in reality. Let's assume that the percentages of people who exercise frequently is actually 63% of those aged 15 to 34, 31% of those aged 35 to 55, and 10% of those aged 55 or older. Based on this distribution, you will find that 45% of the total population exercises frequently. But in our example, the larger number of young adults in the sample produces data that indicates a higher 52% of the population exercises frequently. To compensate for sampling bias, the results of the survey are multiplied by specific numerical factors that enhance or reduce their contribution to the overall results to reflect what would have been found if the sample perfectly matched the larger population. In our example, the responses of young adults would be given a negative weighting, while those of older adults would be increased somewhat. Sampling bias is also a factor in the methods used to conduct the survey. In the U.S., surveys are generally conducted by telephone. This means that the population being sampled is in reality not the entire population. Rather, it is the universe of households with telephones, which encompasses about 95% of all households in the U.S. In general, this provides an acceptable basis for most U.S. surveys. However, certain groups are more likely than others to not have telephones, which means that the sample is biased against those groups. In niche marketing, these kinds of sampling biases can be important. For example, many low-income Latinos in the U.S. do not have telephones. Companies that want to reach this group will need to take into account the sampling bias of telephone surveys and either try to adjust using statistical methods or use a different survey methodology. Although it is controversial, some survey research organizations are beginning to use the Internet to conduct surveys. The impetus behind this is cost. Internet surveys are far less expensive than telephone or in-person surveys. However, American households are even less likely to have an Internet connection than a telephone, and the population that is online is even more skewed toward certain groups, such as those with high incomes. This is not to say that you should not conduct surveys by telephone or through the Internet. Rather, it means that you must be precise in how you interpret the data. A telephone survey reflects the opinions of people in households with telephones, while an internet survey reflects the opinions of those with internet connections. The mistake is to assume that you can draw firm conclusions about the entire population based on these survey methods. As surveys become more prevalent, they also have become more and less popular. People often resent being interrupted while engaged in other activities, and many refuse to take part in surveys. The number of people who do so is called the non-response rate, and it's a growing problem. If non-respondents were evenly distributed across the population, that is, if the percentage of people who refused to answer was the same in every segment of the total population, this would not be an issue. However, non-respondents tend to be concentrated in certain groups, such as older adults, while response weighting compensates to some degree for this bias. It is important to remember that if the niche market you are targeting has a high non-response rate, you should exercise caution in interpreting the results of the survey. Conversely, as I mentioned a moment ago, people are also often eager to voice their opinion about specific issues. Catering to this desire, many organizations, such as magazines, newspapers, and other media, give people the opportunity to participate in surveys by calling or writing or going online to answer survey questions. Often, these results are reported as if they were surveys based on random samples, with at best a brief disclaimer that the survey is not scientific. These are the most heavily biased results one can obtain, since the base of respondents is solely those motivated to express their opinion rather than a random sample of the population. The results of surveys that are not based on random samples should simply be ignored. Although reputable survey groups try not to use data from biased samples, this is not true for all organizations. Groups that have a particular point they want to make, whether in politics, social issues, or business, sometimes publicize the results of biased surveys without revealing the fact that the group of people sampled is not really representative of the population. This is one reason that it is good to know as much as possible about how the survey was conducted, how many people participated, and whether or not the results were weighted to reflect the actual population. Perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of survey methodology is question wording. This is one of the key sources of inaccuracy in survey results. Questions that are poorly worded or worse, deliberately misleading, create results that do not accurately reflect the population. This is why it is important to know the exact wording of the question that was asked of respondents when evaluating survey results. It can be difficult to evaluate the effect of subtle differences in question wording, but knowing exactly what was asked still helps in interpreting the data. Most of the larger survey research organizations have considerable experience in understanding how to construct good survey questions. But even these groups can make mistakes. The simplest evaluation you can make is to ask yourself what the question means to you. Is it clear and concise? Or is it vague enough to allow for a wide variety of interpretations? For example, a survey might ask respondents to agree or disagree with the statement, "Price is important to me when considering which brands to buy." We would not be surprised to learn that most people would agree with this statement. What it doesn't tell us is how important price is compared to other factors, such as quality. Worse, would be a statement such as, "My family is so important to me that I will not sacrifice quality for price when buying for them." Disagreeing with this statement would be almost impossible, since doing so would imply that the respondent doesn't really care about his or her family. Although random sampling makes surveys fairly accurate, the results are not perfect. Various factors can cause the results to differ somewhat from the true opinions or behavior, or even characteristics, of the population. Knowing how far off from reality the data is likely to be is an important element in evaluating the results. The primary statistic provided to make this evaluation is called the margin of error. This is often presented as a number with a plus and minus sign in front of it. For example, suppose you are evaluating the results of a survey about different flavor preferences. The results indicate that 46% prefer orange flavor, while 40% prefer strawberry. This would seem to say that orange is clearly preferred over strawberry. But the margin of error is plus or minus 3 percentage points. This means that the true percentage of people who prefer orange is within a range of 43% to 49%. While the range of those preferring strawberry is likely to be between 37% and 43%. In other words, it is possible that in reality, the percentage of people who prefer orange is the same as the percentage who prefer strawberry. Margin of error is directly related to sample size. The larger the sample, the smaller the margin of error. This is another reason that larger samples are sometimes needed when examining niche markets. For example, suppose that we had a sample of only 500 people, and we wanted to know more about the 46% of these respondents who prefer orange flavors. You might look at their responses to other questions in the survey, such as whether or not they drink coffee or soft drinks, to get more information about them. But since there are only 250 people in this group, the margin of error would be higher than it is for the overall sample of 500. This becomes a large problem when the size of subsets of the survey respondents are smaller than 100, and it can mean that the results have a fairly high degree of inaccuracy. While they still may be useful in pointing to areas that should be examined in more detail, the results themselves would have to be used with caution. In other words, it would be a mistake to base a business decision on a small sample of the population. In summary, knowing how a survey is properly constructed and conducted is vital to evaluating its usefulness. Surveys with low sample sizes or poor question wording should not be relied on in decision making. During the next segment, we will turn our attention to some of the useful data we can obtain from good surveys.
Let's begin with the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call and that these questions be as brief